Awesome possum. Oh, hey. Hey.
Good morning.
Hey, we are live. Hey, Sioux Falls. Hey, Facebook. Hey, Twitch. Hey, everyone who might be listening to this after the fact. This is me, Caleb. Caleb Van Vooren, host of the Overcoming podcast here. Here with my little tech guy, my podcast network. I don't know, connoisseur.
Yeah.
All of a sudden I blanked on my words. Robert Mailing.
I prefer Emperor. No.
Emperor. Yeah, Emperor Mailing. Gosh, all of a sudden it sounds like you're about to rule 5th century China.
Yeah. That's a good century. 5th century is a good century.
5th century is really, like, of all the single digit centuries, I think the 5th century has to be the best.
Yeah. 2nd century wasn't bad, but yeah, you're right. I gotta go with the 5th.
You gotta go with the 5th. But really, the 14th century has to take the cake as far as just, like, teens.
Nice.
I mean, come on, that's when Old English was in its prime. That's when Beowulf came out. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Some legendary stuff.
The Miller's Tale.
Yeah.
It's like, who knew medieval stuff could be so dirty?
Exactly. Medievals were crazy dirty. It's the Puritans that screwed it up.
Yep.
It's the 1600s that really kind of... like, Shakespeare, crazy dirty. Like, it's... fun stuff. But yeah, so we are here. Let's see here. It is Sunday, November 11th, and so that's going to be Veterans Day, or globally, more commonly referred to, especially in Europe, as Armistice Day. And to mark the end of World War I, we are actually 100 years today from the end of World War I, which is a really kind of amazing thing. That 100 years ago we ended what was supposed to be the war to end all wars.
How'd that work out?
Right? Let's ask some of our U.S. subordinates. So yeah, we are doing quite well, but that kind of feeds into kind of what we are going to talk about today, which is some pretty cool stuff, both in relation to me and my journey over the past 6 weeks, as well as the past 12 years. And then also something a lot of our veterans face, and a lot of our veterans have struggled with. And kind of this podcast is all about overcoming struggle. So, just some quick housekeeping things. Knock out of the way before we kind of dive into kind of the main meat of the podcast here. If you're just joining us for the first time, this is our second episode on this kind of relaunch. This would technically be episode, I think, 17 or 18. We kind of relaunched a whole new fresh face, and so the previous episodes are still up and available on YouTube. We will probably be taking them down sometime in the next few weeks. So if you want to dive into those, please do. There's some really great content there, but we'll probably make them a part of a Patreon or some other sort of a subscriber, donor kind of bonus sometime in the future. So take advantage of them for free while you can, because there's some really great content in there and a lot of really great people. Too. We officially have a website now, overcomingpodcast.com.
Woo!
It's really exciting. That'll be fun transitioning into a kind of full media platform. So it's going to be a blog. It's also we'll be hosting. The podcast will also be up on there. Like I said, blog. I'll probably link to the YouTube channel from there. We'll probably also get some other content up there. I'm really excited to kind of see what that develops into. I don't have a ton of huge concrete plans right now. I'm hoping to really kind of build out the site this weekend and have it up fully and running on our next episode, which will be 2 weeks from now, because right now we are bi-weekly. So there will be some guest blogs up there. There will be personal blogs, all kinds of fun, really cool stories to tell on that site. So if you have any interest in guest posting on the Overcoming Podcast blog, or being a guest here, please feel free to email me at overcomingpc@gmail.com. We'll talk some stuff and we'll get you up there. Last minute things, be sure to like, follow, subscribe, do all that stuff on all our channels, social media channels. We're on Facebook, the Overcoming Podcast with Caleb Van Vooren. We are on Instagram at OvercomingPC. We are also on Twitter at OvercomingPC, and we are also live stream on Facebook, and I think we're on Twitch right now, right?
We are.
We are on Twitch right now, and that's Sioux Empire, correct?
Yep.
Right. Yeah, so twitch.tv/Sue Empire for all that fun, beautiful stuff. So be sure to like, follow, subscribe, do all that fun stuff on all those channels. It's going to be some pretty cool content in the next few weeks, few months, and years, hopefully. Let's see if we can win some awards. Maybe go on tour, Robert.
There you go.
Be exciting. So now we'll kind of dive into kind of the meat of the podcast. So this is kind of a pretty tough, has been a really tough topic for me over the past couple of years. It's been something I've dealt with, kind of throughout most of my life since, I was probably around 9 or 10. And it's something that took me a really long time to come to terms with. It's something that a lot of my friends have had to come to terms with. I'm friends with particularly several veterans who have had to come to terms with the same thing, which is a little something called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is something that's it's kind of really dear to my heart because it's something that's been holding me back for a really long time, and I didn't realize that it was for the longest time. PTSD to me has always been this something that you have to go through a really, really big, dramatic, violent event to experience. A lot of times in our popular culture, it was one, just not talked about for the longest time, and then when it was always this immediate flashback to one very clear, specific event all the time, and it always kind of described your reactions to PTSD in a very kind of like small way, so for the longest time I didn't think that I had PTSD. Pause for a dramatic effect. As an aside, it's always weird when you're talking kind of to yourself in a room like this, and all of a sudden you go, throat gets a little dry, so you go take a drink, and all of a sudden you notice exactly how quiet it is when you're in a room alone. And everyone's sitting there waiting for you to finish drinking. It's something that I'm not sure it will ever not seem weird and awkward. You'll get there. Right. It eventually you're just like doing laundry on camera. You just don't care. You don't notice it. So. just full Real Housewives. Yeah, it's something like that. What was that webcam in the 90s where that lady in the apartment just let it webcam her like constantly? She was like the first person to do that, so it's just like super mundane constantly. I don't know. I don't remember which one that was. That might be a little too old for me. It was too old for me, but there was an NPR thing about it a while back. NPR is great. Good old NPR. Fun little asides. But yeah. So, but what I just did there is actually, unwittingly, is a symptom of PTSD. Which is something when it comes along, which is a really, really big one, which is something called avoidance. And you may not realize you're doing it. A lot of times over time it becomes a bit ingrained that when you begin to think about, talk about, or get in any sort of environment that begins to remind you of your trauma, you automatically begin to avoid it because you don't want to experience those emotions. You don't want to experience that pain. You don't want to experience that suffering anymore. And so you have just learned that if I avoid these things completely, then I don't feel that pain anymore. Which is what I did for a really long time, to the point in which I no longer realized I was doing it. And so we'll talk a little bit kind of about my trauma, and then we'll kind of go into how I accepted the fact that I did have PTSD and have been now undergoing treatment for it for the past few weeks. Extremely, extremely difficult treatment. I'm not going to sugarcoat that at all for anyone who might look at getting it. It is not an easy thing to do, but wholly worthwhile. So, for me, this will be kind of a big step forward because I'll actually be able to talk about my trauma. If I get a little teary-eyed, my apologies in advance. Something that happens, but for me, I always had it's had a bit of a rocky relationship with my father, um, as some would say. He's my father is actually my stepfather. My biological father was never really a part of my life. He and my mom amicably split ways. Right before, shortly after I was born, I just kind of realized that they weren't going to be a good match for each other. But he always did right by me. He provided me health insurance for my whole life up until a little after a bit I turned 18, which for someone who suffers from a genetic disease and I was undergoing annual treatment for that disease, that was a big, big, big lifesaver for me. And so I'm eternally grateful to my biological father for that, even though I have no memory of ever meeting him. I know he's had a big impact on my life being as healthy as it is today. So I'm very thankful to him for that. But what then happened is that my mom met a man, got pregnant, and then got married with my little sister. And so that man is the man which I refer to as my father, only because he is the one who I essentially consider the one who raised me. I may not have come from his blood, but he is my father in all aspects but that. But it was always kind of a rocky relationship in the sense that we just weren't really interested in the same things. I never really felt like I belonged. I never really felt like he wanted me around. For a lot of reasons, and I could go into detail for hours upon hours upon hours upon why that is. But that in and of itself doesn't lead to PTSD. That doesn't lead to abuse, right? That just leads to a somewhat unhealthy relationship. And something that millions of people have experienced in their lives, not quite getting along with one of their parents, because they just aren't interested in the same things. That's perfectly okay. That's not something that was incredibly terrible to experience. Even though it can be something that you do have to struggle and move past. When it kind of turned to abuse, was when my father intentionally began to tell me things such as I'm worthless, began to tell me that I would never succeed in anything, began to push me around, challenge me, try to get me to fight him, throw me up against walls, so quite regularly just continually night after night after night berate me about what I was doing or what I wasn't doing. Kind of whatever I did would never be good enough, and it was quite painful, both physically and emotionally. It was something that I really, really struggled with. It was something that I could not really deal with. But for the longest time, I recognized that this was hard, but I began to judge it. I began to describe it as, oh, well, who doesn't get in arguments with their parents, right? What father doesn't yell at their son, right? It's just boys being boys when you kind of roughhouse around a little bit, right? Despite the fact that if I were to ever describe to someone just non-partially a father throwing their 14-year-old son out into the lawn in the middle of February and chasing him around, begging him to fight him to prove that he's a man, as effective parenting. Exactly. Like, right over there can see, oh, hey, that's awful. But for me, that was what normal was. And so I could never, because that's what my daily life was like for upwards of 12 years, I could not fathom that anyone else lived a life different than mine. Lived a life with a parent that did not do that to them. And it became really, really hard for me to recognize the trauma that this really was for me. But what did begin to happen is I began to experience several of the symptoms of PTSD. One, throughout my teens, mid and late teens, I was incredibly reckless. Driving quickly, driving erratically. Substance abuse, as well as just self-harming behavior. Lots of things associated with trying to avoid pain and trying to feel in control. I also began to stop doing the things that I love to do. I stopped playing video games because they would remind me of the times that my father yelled at me. Right? I stopped reading, something that I was incredibly passionate about, because it would suddenly begin to remind me of the fact that my father thought I was a loser because I liked books. Right? I would, there were all these things in my life that I began to stop doing, that I began to avoid, because even in subtle little ways they began to remind me of the abuse I suffered. Right? But I didn't recognize that. I just began to say, oh, I'm getting older, and so now I just don't want to do these things anymore. Right? And so what began to happen is, when I think about reading a book, all of a sudden I'd start to talk about reading books, but then I'd stop reading them. Right? I'd build myself up, but then I would go find and do something else, because I told myself this is what I would rather be doing. And I started to stop going home, right, to the place where I grew up. I started to stop visiting towns where I knew I might run into my father. I started to stop communicating with my father's side of the family. Purely because nothing that they did, because they're amazing and wonderful and I love them, but because I might have to deal with him. Some of them much more intentional decisions than others. But throughout all of that, I never really recognize the subtle things that would happen to me, which is one of the reasons that I would tend to struggle so much when I came up against success. Which, like I said, can't be 100% blamed on my father, but the trauma I suffered is a very large part of it. Whereas this idea that whenever I would begin to approach succeeding at something that that was important to me, that was challenging, I would all of a sudden begin to panic. I begin to doubt whether I would ever be able to really succeed at it. And so I just gave up. Because it's better to fail on my own terms than to fail at having done it. Better to give up than to fail is essentially the mantra. And I didn't realize that I was doing this for the longest time up until probably around this past August, where I was working on something for a client. And I had over a month to get it done. And it was a really big project. And I just kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And beginning to just accept the fact that I was going to fail because I'm a failure. Not because I didn't do the work. And I talked to my therapist about this. And we talked about... And my therapist is well versed in some of the things that I experienced with my father and how negative that had been in my life. But something that, in general, I don't talk about very freely because it's pretty hard for me. But she said, hey, you have PTSD. And I'm just like, what? No, I don't. That's not something that I suffered from. I didn't go to war. I wasn't assaulted, right? How could I possibly have PTSD? And since, like I said, this is a Veterans Day episode, and I'm friends with several veterans. Let's see, I'm currently working with one. I'm working with several at my day job, but in my business, I'm working with one as well. I previously interviewed a veteran on this show. Is in one of our legacy episodes. Raymond Camper, a good friend of mine. One of a former roommate's husband is also a veteran. And most of them that I know suffer from some form of PTSD, but almost none of them recognize that they do, and or are willing to seek treatment for it. Which isn't meant to be a judgment on them. It's more meant to recognize that this is something that's very pervasive in our society, not only amongst veterans, but also amongst just the general population, from ineffective parenting to sexual assaults on women, right? That don't breach, the popular version of rape, right? But just just the constant harassment that they might experience in their lives because of the way they look, or any number of other things that people are experiencing that are actually real traumas in their lives, that can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if not dealt with appropriately, and are very difficult to then kind of live lives to their fullest. It's something that a lot of people struggle with. And it's something that I struggled with, and I couldn't recognize until my therapist gave me it wasn't this exact one. It was pretty similar, though, laid out. But it's the DSM-5 criteria for PTSD. Preface this, I am not a therapist or a counselor. I am not licensed in any way. I cannot diagnose any one person with PTSD. I do not have the qualifications to do that, so please don't think that I am. I only accept my own diagnosis, as well as in this case, I'm going to begin to describe some of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. A link to this particular diagnostic criteria will be available in our show notes. So if you are someone who maybe hears some of these symptoms and wonders, hey, might I fit the criteria for having PTSD? Should I maybe consider seeking help? This will be available for you to go ahead and look at a separate time. And in the final show notes, we'll probably also get some links to some resources for you to be able to find a therapist and seek help. Because you may, even if you're a vet, you may not want to go to the VA. Right, and if you're not a vet, there are plenty of other amazing resources out there for you. And so I'll work on tracking some of those down and getting them available in our notes. But overall, there are a few separate kind of diagnostic criteria for PTSD, right? And I'll go through a couple of them right now, right? This one lists them as like criterion A, B, C, D. I think there's an E, F, G, H, I as well. There's quite a few of them. You don't necessarily need to meet all to have some form of PTSD. If you do meet all, like I said, I can't diagnose you, but I would highly suggest that you likely have PTSD and should seek help. No judgment there. I want you to live the best, most happy life that you can. So, again here, criterion A would be, in this case, is kind of your stressor, right? So what would be the thing that causes the PTSD? In this case, it would be either a direct exposure to that stressor, right? And so this can be if you're exposed to death, threatened death, actual threatened serious injury, or actual threatened sexual violence, or severe emotional abuse. So this would be either direct exposure, witnessing that in person. You don't always have to be the the subject of an abuse or a trauma to be affected by it. Think somewhat just witnessing a deadly car accident could be incredibly traumatic. Right? Indirectly, even by learning, say a relative or a close friend was exposed to trauma, the event involved actual or threatened death and must have been violent or accidental. Crazy stuff. Or a repeat or extreme indirect exposure to adverse details of the event, usually in the course of professional duties. A lot of times this might be first responders, collecting body parts, professionals repeat exposed to details of child abuse. This does not include indirect non-professional exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures. It's unlikely you would develop PTSD due to watching movies. Just if in case you were wondering, like don't go telling your kids that they can't watch Game of Thrones because they're going to get PTSD. It is unlikely that would be the cause. But then there's a couple of other things here. Criterion B, right? So this is going to be some intrusion symptoms. Technically, only one of these is be required for you to be on the steps to being diagnosed with PTSD. Oh, hey, Robert pulled that up on screen there. A lovely guy. See, this is what's amazing about having a tech person, as an aside. It's kind of why I came under the Super Empire podcast to begin with. It's because just being able to have support while you're doing stuff, especially stuff that's hard to talk about, is invaluable, and I greatly appreciate it. So, yeah, thank you very much for that, sir. Yeah, so Criterion B, like I said, I'm not necessarily going to read off all of these because only one of them is required, but you may experience all of them. Which, like I said, so, like, you don't feel like you have to experience only one, and, like, if you're experiencing more than one, somehow that means you're wrong. But, for example, recurrent involuntary and intrusive memories. So, obviously we don't need to care about the notes about children, right? But this is something that I know I would experience quite often, where minor things would all of a sudden make me go back to lifelike moments of being screamed at by my father. And I know veterans who all of a sudden they might hear, they might hear a car backfire or something similar, and all of a sudden they're consumed memories of time on the battlefield. It can be pretty big things. Traumatic nightmares, dissociative reactions. This is another common one that people think they must experience, but they don't necessarily have to, right? But this is kind of where you kind of leave your body and all of a sudden you're back in the moment. Flashbacks. It's pretty big. It's a pretty big one. It happens to me upon occasion. Not very often. It generally goes into the memories for me, but all these can kind of be something big. And then Criterion C is a really, really big one. This is one that most people, like I said, as I kind of talked about before, this is a really, really big symptom of PTSD. This is something that if you're doing in relation to a trauma, you very likely have PTSD. But it's avoidance, right? So you're avoiding trauma-related thoughts or feelings and trauma-related external reminders. People, places, conversations, activities, objects, or situations, and or all of the above. They can be pretty big. And avoidance is a really, really big key, and you'll probably experience both or one, but you'll definitely be avoiding things, even if you're not fully aware of it. Kind of then onto Criterion D, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, right? And so this might be you can't, kind of when your memory begins to go fuzzy, right? The ability to recall key features of a traumatic event. Persistent and often distorted negative beliefs and expectations about oneself. This is one that I want to talk about a little bit. Only because it's something that I experienced a lot, and a lot of victims of childhood abuse experience, which is a lot of real big negative feelings because for me, like I said, it was prolonged abuse. It was 12 years of just prolonged abuse, day after day, week after week. And what most people don't realize is that what begins to happen is, even though those things may not be true, you begin to believe them. Even if you can factually and rationally step back and say that they aren't true, right? I can step back and say I'm not a failure because I know I have succeeded at things, right? But if you were to really ask me ask me if I believed that, I wouldn't be able to tell you that. I know I'm not, but I believe I am. And that's something that I'm working through therapy right now to try to overcome. But it's amazing how much these beliefs can be deeply ingrained in you. It's like just how much they can negatively impact your life. I don't want anyone to ever have to deal with that long term, because it is such like a nightmare to kind of begin to push through, because kind of no matter what, if those beliefs are deeply held inside of you and you don't go through the work to overcome them and kind of crush those beliefs, then they will hold you back from achieving what you want to do in your life. You might not realize it, right? But there will be a lot of things in your life that you don't do because of those beliefs. And if you're okay with that, then then okay. But I don't think most people are okay giving up on their dreams just because of what someone might have said to them when they were 13. And so if you're experiencing that or any of these other symptoms, please, like I said, begin to reach out and seek some help. There's other ones here. Mark diminished interest in pre-traumatic significant activities. Right, this one was tough for me to be able to recognize. If you suffered a prolonged abuse, because what you may realize is that you enjoyed these things while the abuse was going on, because they're kind of your escape. They're a way for you to kind of deal with the abuse, or I guess the trauma that you were suffering. But then after the fact, right, this might be something that you enjoyed pre-trauma, right, but now all of a sudden, because it helped you get through the trauma, post-trauma, you don't do them anymore because they remind you of the trauma. And so for me, that was reading, right? It was sports, it was gaming, it was a lot of things that I used to get me through my trauma. All of a sudden, once I kind of separated myself from it for a little bit, all of a sudden I wasn't interested in doing these things anymore. Which is a pretty big deal. So on to criterion E, like alterations in arousal and activity, and reactivity. So this is just kind of when you start to experience a lot more irritable or aggressive, maybe self-destructive or reckless behavior. Or you might become hypervigilant. Right, particularly when you might be exposed to something that reminds you of your trauma. I'm not going to name names, but there's an individual at my work who deeply resembles my father. And through no fault of his own, I cannot help but feel terrified and hypervigilant when he is around. And so hypervigilance might be the need to constantly know where a person or thing is in a room. This may be... Hypervigilance might be best described if you're particularly afraid of a spider or a type of insect, which is this idea that all of a sudden you notice one and you have to track it, because it's the concept that it might come get me. But if I know where it is, then I can avoid it. In a very, very simplistic term and kind of a little playful one that most people experience, right? It's this idea that spider, no, and just constantly following it around until you can kind of get out of its vicinity. It's a really, really big thing, but it can also manifest in when you're in a location. Maybe your trauma occurred in a grocery store or a field or something along those lines, and so when you enter that location, kind of against your better judgment and avoidance behaviors, you may become hypervigilant and begin to very and trust me, it's very exhausting to have to constantly keep an eye out for a threat that probably isn't there.
Yeah, and hypervigilance is not good for your blood pressure or for other health conditions like your cardiac system. Your it's not good in general.
No, it is definitely not. And
blood pressure, that's what I was trying to think of. Your blood pressure, it's bad for.
Yeah, definitely, because essentially it begins to heighten your cortisol levels, begins to get the heart rate going, get the blood pressure rising, because who knows, you might be attacked at any moment and have to flee. I make a little bit of a joke of that, but it's very, very real. And a lot of people might all of a sudden smile a little bit at that, in part because it might make them a little uncomfortable to think about the fact that, oh, hey, I do experience that. And so, like I said, this might be a little bit hard to listen to, kind of all of these, but what you begin to realize is that a lot more people, I think, than they realize have PTSD in one form or another that is holding them back in their lives. And so criterion F, right? So we're kind of through kind of the main symptoms, right? But criterion F is duration. So for it to really be a post-traumatic stress disorder and not kind of an immediate trauma reaction, they have to persist for greater than a month. And then criterion G, functional significance, significant symptom-related distress or functional impairment, right? Don't treat that as something bigger than it has to be. Like I said, I can't fully diagnose you, but it doesn't have to be that all of a sudden you can't get a job or you can't go to the store or something along those lines because of this. It could just be something as simple as I have to take an extra 30-minute route to work because the most direct route takes me by the building where my abuser works, and I can't get that close even though I would never see him or interact with him. Just driving by would be too much for me. Or I can't go home and see friends and family because if I'm anywhere in the same town as where that trauma took place, I can't do it. Right? I said it can be, if it's holding you back from experiencing your life, or it could even be something where those persistent beliefs that I talked about, like for me, where I talked about the fact that I would often fail at things because I believed I was a failure, and so I would quit. And I wouldn't put the work in and succeed where logically I knew I could succeed, because emotionally I believed I was a failure, and so it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? That in and of itself is something that shows PTSD that needs to be treated. And there can be, like I said, you will likely suffer from multiples of these, but you do not need to. And so functional significance does not have to be some giant, big, amazing thing that that kind of Hollywood and things of that nature have made it out to be. It can be something relatively, I don't want to say minor because it's major to you, but it relatively simple. And then kind of the last criterion is attribution. You want to make sure that the things that you're experiencing can't be attributed to a medication, substance abuse, or other illness that you're suffering from at the moment. These are kind of the really, really big thing there. Like you want to make sure that you're not experiencing these symptoms because you just took meth or shrooms and you're on a super bad trip, right? You want to make sure that whatever you're experiencing this with is associated to an actual event or trauma that you've experienced, not necessarily an illness or something along those lines in your life. But don't get me wrong, suffering from cancer and having survived it can be a trauma, right? When it says illness, what that means is that you're not having, for example, a brain tumor that's causing dissociative episodes and hypervigilance and things of that nature by putting pressure on the brain, but having survived a brain surgery, right, can be a trauma, right? Just for kind of those differing little kind of subtleties there. That's. I'm a little uncomfortable right now because I just talked about it a lot. So you might notice even now I'm experiencing the symptoms of PTSD, which is just trying to grab onto things, getting a little bit further, a little hypervigilant at the moment, because talking about it obviously puts me back in the place in which I experienced that trauma, right? Which makes me begin to experience those symptoms of fear, the symptoms of wanting to avoid, or the symptoms of feeling unsafe, and having to look around the room and make sure that, God forbid, my father doesn't walk through the wall behind that TV screen. However rational that sounds, I can feel that fear being realized. And so I kind of want to reach out, because like I said, this is a really kind of prescient day for this, because PTSD is something that affects a lot of people and leads to a lot of suicides. It leads to depression and anxiety and this feeling that no matter what you do, you'll never be able to escape that trauma that you experience. And so the only solution, right, the only coping mechanism that you have is to end your life. And veteran suicide is an epidemic in this country. Suicide in general is an epidemic in this country. It is something that is vastly underreported and vastly under-talked about. It's something that, I made at least 5 separate attempts in my life. And thankfully I failed at each of them. But they were all very serious, and any one of them could have succeeded.
Well, we're glad you're still here.
Yeah. Thank you, brother. And this is kind of why I started this podcast in the first place, right? Which is the ability to talk to about your struggle and how you overcame it, and like thoughts of suicide and depression and kind of the trauma that can often lead to them are really, really serious things that need to be treated seriously and need to be talked about. You need to understand that that's okay. That you don't need to judge your symptoms. You don't need to judge your experience, and seek help because there's nothing that you've experienced that can't be overcome and that can't be treated. All of it can be. It can all be treated very well and very effectively. Gary Vee kind of talks about this a little bit in regards to business and entrepreneurship, right? But it applies to every other aspect of life, specifically this, which is if anybody else has succeeded and that looks like you, then you can do it too, right? Is this idea that right, if the black kid from Detroit managed to build a business and get out, right, and you're a black kid from Detroit, then you can do it too, right? So, that if you're a white farm boy from Iowa, right, and you want him to be a pro NFL player, and that he did, right, then then you can too. If anyone who looks like you did it, then you can do it. And I can guarantee that when it comes to PTSD and overcoming PTSD, and overcoming depression and finding happiness, someone who looks exactly like you, who experienced the things that you experienced, did it. And that means that you can too, even if it doesn't always feel like it. So that's kind of it for today. Kind of tough thing to talk about, but this was amazing. So this has been the Overcoming Podcast. With me, Caleb Van Vooren, our Emperor Mailing, the Sioux Empire Podcast, as our tech guy. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe on all relevant platforms. That's Facebook as the Overcoming Podcast with Caleb Van Vooren. We also we'll probably be pushing out to the YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks, right? But that's also the Overcoming Podcast with Caleb Van Vooren. We are on Twitter at OvercomingPC, Instagram at OvercomingPC. You can email me at overcomingpc@gmail.com. The website will be coming soon, overcomingpodcast.com. And be sure to check out our network. So that's the Sioux Empire Podcast. Right, so Facebook, right there, at Empire Podcast. Twitch.tv/Sioux Empire. Facebook / what's Facebook again?
That was what was just up Facebook.
Oh, that was Facebook. Oh, gosh. Yeah. The SiouxEmpire.com is the website, and then Twitter. Twitter's the one I forgot, which is...
Podcast Empire.
Which is Podcast Empire, yeah. I can never tag us on Twitter appropriately. So, yeah, so Twitter is Podcast Empire. So be sure to check out all of those. Like, follow, subscribe, share, do all that fun stuff. Some really amazing things on the network that everyone else can look at. Any other plugs that you want to add?
I think you covered it.
Awesome. So we're going to... Good to go, so we're just going to sign off. Thanks, Uvalds.
Thanks, everybody.